Linlithgow has lost so much over the centuries. Once one of the most influential royal boroughs in Scotland, the site of a vitally important royal residence, a member of the court of the four boroughs, a prosperous trading town with a busy seaport, all that slowly declined until by the mid-19th century, it was a shadow of its former self. Industry on the decline and the town bankrupted by the lost railway case. And here is that residence of the Stuart monarchs. Since the year 1746, just a roofless ruin, a shell, its walls blackened by the fire which swept through the building when a troop of government dragoons hurriedly left, leaving their fires still burning. The argument still rages over whether this was by design, an attempt to obliterate the palace of the Stuarts, the lineage which the Jacobites were trying to restore, or was it a true accident? Eminent architect James Colley published his account in 1834 and declared that the conflagration was caused by embers falling from unattended fires in the dining room of the North Wing, the place where the government soldiers were sleeping on that cold January evening. He further asserted that he had spoken in his youth to an old Linlithgow resident who had witnessed the fire and had later gone up to the palace where all the talk was of its starting in that long, narrow dining room. Indeed, a room which bore every sign that it was the origin of the blaze. Arras tapestries were completely destroyed. The wooden floor was nothing but charred timber mixed with burnt straw. The building was lost to Linlithgow, to royalty, totally uninhabitable, and with the wooden roofs gone, it fell into complete ruin. Stories abound of locals rummaging in the remains and removing items from rooms that were not so badly damaged. Tapestries, eiderdowns, architectural details, stone relics all vanished, to turn up later in local living rooms or at auctions or on the wall of the Four Marys. Everything I've ever read about the palace maintained that the building, which caught fire in 1746, was one started from scratch in 1425. The earlier structure, a wooden hunting lodge frequented by King David I, King Edward I on his campaign of subjugation, and David II, son of Robert the Bruce, was always said to have been totally destroyed when an invading English army ransacked Linlithgow in 1424 and set fire to the manor house, which, being made largely of wood, burned to the ground. But fairly recently, this account has been challenged. In the year 2012, the German fashion designer Karl Lagerfeld, as creative director for Chanel, staged a magnificent fashion show in the courtyard. A covered catwalk was built, lit by torches and flaming cauldrons, and models, including Stella Tennant, showed off Lagerfeld's interpretations of traditional Scottish dress. It cost a fortune to stage, including a substantial sum given to historic Scotland. And that paid for the hiring of an archaeological team to explore the palace in much closer analytic detail than ever before. And the result was the revelation that much of the earlier hunting lodge had survived the fire and had been incorporated into the construction of the new building, because that earlier edifice had largely been constructed of stone, not wood as previously thought. And this enabled the building to be habitable fairly soon after the English attack. It is recorded that King James I stayed in his new residence in mid-1425, an impossible feat if the building had been that badly damaged. Something that's always interested me is what was an English army doing in Linlithgow in the 1420s, a century after the Scottish nation had achieved independence from English control. I've never come across any precise date for this incident, and indeed any relevant information was hard to find. It was a lost piece of Linlithgow's history. However, it would appear that the invasion was not by an organized official military force, but was instead conducted by a band of brigands, mostly from the north of England. and made up largely of farmers who had been robbed by Scottish border reivers. Sheep and cattle rustling went on all the time during the long-running Anglo-Scottish feud, and quite often one side or other took revenge. The attack on Scotland came with some official backing, however, as the English monarch, Henry VI, was anxious to teach the Scots a lesson after 4,000 Scottish soldiers, as part of the Old Alliance, had just fought alongside a French army against the English at the Battle of Verneuil in Normandy, one of the many clashes in the 100 Years' War, and one almost lost to history, although its consequences were as great as those following the more famous Battle of Agincourt. The Scots contingent was badly beaten, and no mercy was shown to them. Hundreds of wounded were afterwards slaughtered on the battlefield. To teach the Scots a further lesson, the invasion of Scotland was sanctioned, and Linlithgow was indeed attacked. But it was largely a token gesture. Buildings were ransacked, goods were plundered, and then the small makeshift force returned to England. The King of Scots played no part in encouraging the Scottish military presence in France. From the age of 12, he had been held captive in England after being captured by English pirates while trying to get to France to escape feuding Scottish nobles. And he remained in English hands for 18 years, only being released on the promise of a £40,000 ransom, £10,000 of which was deducted as a dowry payment for marrying an English wife, Joan of Beaufort. James and his new bride arrived back in Scotland in 1424, and the attack on Linlithgow may also have been part of a plan to warn the Scots king that he was still subject to English control and obliged to pay the promised ransom once he obtained the money from his Scottish subjects. There are records kept in the National Archives at Kew which reveal that before his release, James was told about the English attack and that his royal palace in Linlithgow had been totally destroyed, lost to him forever. This document you see here is probably what caused later historians to assume that was true. When the 30-year-old monarch returned to Linlithgow, he did find that his residence had been damaged, but not nearly as badly as he had feared. He allocated £5,000 towards its reconstruction, a huge sum in those days, but not as much as would have been needed had the building been constructed from scratch. Some historians are convinced that King James actually commissioned a complete four-sided residence, not just the east wing with its drawbridge and royal coat of arms, the part he's always been credited with. After years of warfare, weak government and corruption, Scotland's coffers were empty. To raise the money for the reconstruction and to pay off the ransom to the English, James got the Scottish Parliament to pass legislation for a special tax. And as a royal borough, Linlithgow had to find £300, while the Scottish nobles were forced to stump up even more, often having a family member taken as a hostage until they paid. £26,000 was raised, but only 12,000 was sent south, much to English annoyance. The monarch kept the rest, using much of it to restore and renovate his royal dwellings at Falkland, Stirling, and especially Linlithgow, his Palace of Pleasance, as he called it. It's estimated that up until his assassination in 1437, 1/10 of the total royal income was spent on Linlithgow. Historic Scotland, take note and spend a little on removing the scaffolding, please. There was little opposition to James's financial arrangements, as the two most influential and powerful nobles, the 4th Earl of Douglas and the Earl of Buchan, had both been killed at Verneuil. James was free to rule without challenge, and this set the tone of royal supremacy and royal authority for all future Stuart monarchs. The one remaining powerful family were the Albany Stuarts. Robert Stuart had ruled Scotland as regent during the king's time in captivity, and he tried to maintain power. James had several of the family arrested, and Robert and two of his sons were eventually executed. The remaining heir was imprisoned on the Bass Rock, a fortress James used many times to get rid of his enemies. During his absence in England, a considerable amount of royal land had been sold off and so lost to the king's estate. James set about buying it back, regaining, for example, 36 perticates of land, along with all the woods and watering rights thereof, on the east side of the palace. James also fully furnished the palace, with the exchequer accounts showing purchases of tablecloths, napkins, arras tapestries, and loads of containers of paint, so that Matthew, the king's painter, and his team could renovate the building. The palace appears to have been completely equipped by 1429, when the huge wine cellar was stocked with vast quantities of Alsatian and Rhenish wine, brought in enormous casks called butts, from where we get the word butler, initially the official in charge of stock-taking and dispensing alcoholic liquor. Each butt contained 126 gallons, and when the cellar was full, it had room for 50 of these enormous containers, all carted up from Blackness, where they had been landed. Sadly, we have lost this local wine store, along with Ellie's cellar as well. Lost too are the lavish banquets held within the palace. James spent a fortune entertaining visiting notaries, including the Archbishop of Reims, and the High Constable of the Scots Army in France, Sir John Stuart. They came to the palace to discuss the marriage of James's daughter, the 11-year-old Princess Margaret, to the 12-year-old Charles, the Dauphin of France. Another visitor was Alain Chartier, who read to the king and his courtiers from his book Le Livre des Quatre Dames, an epic poem featuring a discussion between four ladies who had all lost their lovers at the Battle of Agincourt. The unchecked Scottish monarch lavished money on St. Michael's, which had also been damaged in the English attack, but again, not as badly as reported. Although the nave needed repair, services could still be held in the chancel, and it's on record that the King and Queen attended a Palm Sunday service in the restored nave in 1428. After that observance, the king, perhaps motivated by vanity as well as religious zeal, paid for a new altar, one dedicated, of course, to Saint James. He also paid for a priest, William Delaney, to say mass at the shrine twice daily. This was the beginning of royal beneficence towards the church, called Kerkwerk, which was continued by all the Stuart monarchs. James III largely finished the major work on the church, adding his own favourite logo to the top of the crown, a cockerel, sheltering his chickens with the Latin inscription, Non dormit qui custodit, he sleeps not who keeps guard. This emblem, being so high up, escaped the ravages of the Reformation. However, the attack on the church by Protestant reformers in 1559 did smash the statues of some 20 saints, which had been placed in niches around the church. Most of the statuary was lost to Linlithgow forever, although carved heads and body parts were later rescued and hidden until a later, more tolerant age. Also destroyed and lost were the many altars inside the building. Only one was spared, the Trinity altar, which continued to be attended to by the first Protestant minister of St. Michael's, Patrick Kinlucky, acting in the role of a tulkin chaplain, that is, a substitute, so called after an original tulkin, which was a stuffed calfskin used to induce a cow to let down her milk. A few pieces of altar frontage were also recovered. These shown here are from a Society of Antiquaries article written by eminent archaeologist James Richardson. They depict Christ being crowned with thorns and a scene from the crucifixion. The largest fragment was placed in the new vestry after its completion in 1894. It depicts Jesus kneeling in prayer, facing the cup of suffering. Seated asleep in the foreground are St. James and St. Peter. Behind is an olive tree representing the Mount of Olives, while on the right is the moment of the betrayal of Christ, the embrace by Judas Iscariot. St. Peter is seen kneeling and sheathing his sword, while in the background stand Roman soldiers. The altars are not the only thing which St. Michael has lost. In 1821, its beautiful stone crown had to be removed. Such structures were notoriously prone to damage due to their elaborate construction and their exposure to the elements. The medieval crown atop King's College in Aberdeen had to be restored in 1634. St. Mary's crown in Haddington lasted even less time, while the crown of St. Giles in Edinburgh was rebuilt in 1648. By 1820, increasing anxiety was being expressed about the state of St. Michael's crowning glory. Local tradesmen were consulted and they reported that, quote, "The spire is in a very dilapidated state, being much rent in many places. Two of the arches are in the worst possible condition and cannot stand for any length of time." Hugh Baird, an engineer working on the Union Canal, was asked for his advice, and he commented, quote, "The great weight of the top part has pressed so heavily against the angles of the tower, it has rent it for a considerable way down. You can still see the cracks if you look inside the tower today." Eminent Edinburgh architect William Byrne, who had remodeled the bins for the Dyell family, was asked for his advice, and he stated, "If the outward pressure extends to a quarter of an inch beyond what it is now, the whole will fall to the ground." Various suggestions were made as to how the arches and tower could be strengthened with iron bands, but the cost was going to be enormous. Is this ringing bells, Alan Miller? The need to take action was pressing. Consequently, in the summer of 1821, the royal crown of the Stuart monarchs was removed. And for over 140 years, the church remained shorn of its topmost feature, until the year 1964, when a modern replacement was constructed, the arresting new creation depicting the crown of thorns, its spiky concept, an evocation of the object placed on Christ's head on the way to his crucifixion. The creation was designed by a 40-year-old sculptor, Geoffrey Clark, who, for a fee of 200 guineas, produced in a contemporary style something which would reflect the fact that St. Michael's was not just a historic edifice lost in its past, but part of a relevant modern spiritual community. He based his design on Christian symbolism, although, ironically, he had lost his own faith. The innovative construction had many detractors, including MP Tam Dalyell, and indeed the general trustees of the Church of Scotland. Even Geoffrey Clark was apparently never that pleased with the final colour. At the dedication of the spire, he was heard to remark he considered it too brassy. In time, the crown gradually became a much-loved local icon, its unforgettable silhouette visible for many miles around. But we might have lost that too, had the damage to the spire not been spotted. Vital repair work and recladding has restored the 58-foot creation, and it's now back to something like the colour, I think, was envisaged by Clark. It has lost its faded silvery sheen, and some may lament that, but it is now back to being the golden sentinel standing guard over the borough. And the project did not just uncover the dangerous state of the woodwork, seen in the bottom left. It also revealed a lost piece of its history. Carved into the cladding were found the names of two of the workers from the Matheson Company who installed the structure in 1964. And that same company, Matheson of Falkirk, were employed to repair the iconic structure, a feat which necessitated an elaborate scaffolding construction and some intrepid steeplejacks with a better head for height than I have. And now the symbolic structure has been resurrected, its once silvered surface now a gleaming gold which will never fade. The old stone crown is not the only thing missing from the Kirkgate. The 17th century Cromwellian soldiers demolished several buildings in order to improve their defensive position on St. Michael's Mount. Among them were the old Catholic sang school, in which boy choristers had been trained in singing Latin chants, along with a more general, if limited, education. The school dated back to a papal decree issued in 1187 by Pope Gregory, so its loss to the town was immense. On the arrival of the Roundheads, the council and the majority of the borough merchants fled over the Forth to Couros, where they set up a makeshift school and encouraged the borough schoolmaster, Alexander Cornwall, to set off from Blackness and join them and continue to teach the children who had fled with their parents. After the troopers left town in 1659, it took a great deal of persuasion before funding was secured to build a new school. It eventually opened in 1670, teaching the classics to inspire youngsters who needed Latin to attend university, where all lectures were delivered in that language. The new building was designed to teach the town's lads or pairts, the brighter boys of the borough. It was staffed by a rector and an assistant called a doctor, whose salaries were paid out of fees which the scholars gave according to the subject studied. In order to augment their salary, the teachers encouraged their charges to bring gifts at Candlemas, and the boy who brought the best present for the teacher was titled Rex Scholae, king of the school. The rector also organised a cockfighting competition, held annually on Shrove Tuesday. The boy whose fighting cock killed all comers was declared the winner with the dubious title of King Cock, while all the dead fowl went into the teacher's dinner pot. We have lost these customs, haven't we? Maybe in the case of cockfighting, that's a good thing. Adam Dawson, in his rambling recollections, recalls other incidents in the life of the school. A thick Latin grammar book, like Ruddiman's Rudiments, made an excellent tool for the black slug squashing competition. The lad whose slug made the most satisfying squelch while being rapidly pressed between the pages of the aforementioned tome won the prize. By 1870, girls were also attending the school, but in a separate girls' class. Plans of the establishment show separate boys and girls' entrances and playgrounds. Here they are pictured in 1890 with their teacher, Mr. Andrew Forrester. Later, mixed classes were the norm, and Dawson remembers the fun which resulted from the time when some male students discovered hibernating bats in the palace and took them into the school inside their clothing. He recalls that the bats awoke in the heat of the classroom, and to the delight of the boys and the horror of the girls, fluttered about the room. The classroom heat was supplied from an open coal fire, clearly seen on this plan, which was drawn up by J. Russell Walker when the school was extended in 1889. On 26 February 1902, the building was gutted by fire, probably when an ember fell from a fire which had been kept burning throughout that cold winter's night. The largely wooden internal construction ignited very fast, and although the town's fire brigade kept their water pump close by, nothing could be done. The building was almost completely destroyed, as can be seen in this photo taken the day after the blaze. The rooms are gutted, the belfry that held the school bell just a shell. Close to the original school was the rectory, which stood on the site now occupied by the Rose Gardens. It too was badly damaged by the Roundhead troopers, and following the departure of the invading army, the ministers of St. Michael's refused to live there, and instead boarded in various buildings in the town, including the Golden Cross Tavern. This continued until the Reverend James Doby arrived in the late 18th century and demanded the Heritors build him a new mass. That is the subject of a later presentation. We cannot blame the Roundheads, though, for the destruction of the Golden Cross. It was removed in the 1960s as part of the new town centre reconstruction. a much lamented building with a Masonic ceiling in a room visited by Robert Burns in 1787. Perhaps by far the biggest act of vandalism committed by Cromwell's soldiers was the demolition of the 13th century town hall, the Tolbooth. It was taken down stone by stone, and the material used to build up a defensive wall around the church, in which the soldiers stabled their horses, while the troopers themselves slept in the attic rooms, the Triforium. This situation lasted until October 1659, when the borough commanders, Leonard Rycock and Lieutenant Evans, led their platoon out of the town. The 36-year-old Provost Robert Stewart, a merchant burgess, began the long process of trying to secure compensation for the destruction wreaked by the garrison. One estimate putting the damage at £20,500, over £20 million today. The borough was sorely in need of assistance, not just for the rebuilding of important structures, but in order to recover the town's economy that had been badly affected by the wars that had seen the population of the borough decline to around 2,500 souls. A plan of action was discussed in many council meetings held in the palace, the only large building still standing in the borough. Eventually, compensation was sanctioned by the Scottish Parliament, and in 1666, Provost Stewart, in his second term of office, was able to commission the Royal Master Mason, John Milne, to draw up plans for a new public building. Sadly, Milne died the next year, so architect John Smith was asked to complete the project. And a fine town hall emerged, with an imposing facade, one of the grandest civic buildings in Scotland. To celebrate the completion, on July 16, 1673, the town's coat of arms, which dated back perhaps to the 12th century, were officially registered. It also appears it was at this time that the town anthem, the Roke and the Row, came into popular usage, its origins in a military march to which words were attached at a later date, and nobody knows them. On the ground floor of the newly opened Tolbooth was a jail for common felons, and halfway up the 6-storey tower was a debtor's prison, a grim lockup for those who could not pay their bills, both perhaps now thankfully lost to antiquity. Atop the tower was a tall, pointed belfry, which was lost in 1847 when a fire ripped through the upper floors, apparently caused by sunlight streaming through a thick pane of bull's eye glass, which magnified the sun's rays and ignited, quote, lumber, papers, and rags kept in the garret. For many hours, fairly inadequate firefighting went on using the town engine, which broke down, and one from Dawson's distillery. To reach the roof, the old inefficient method of a bucket chain had to be employed, resulting in considerable damage to several rooms, the loss of the town bell and clock, and with the complete collapse of the roof, the 17th century spire was lost forever. The rebuild was supervised and largely paid for by Provost Dawson, whose contribution was acknowledged with a tribute carved in stone along the front. The iron loggia called the Piazza, which had been erected in 1810, survived the fire and served as a viewing platform for the wives of civic dignitaries on March's Day until its removal in 1907, when it was replaced by William Scott's magnificent double staircase, more like the original design. In 1857, a new clock was installed in the tower. Made by the firm of Mackenzie and Moncur, it was the first turret clock in Scotland to be constructed on the same principles as the much larger one in the Elizabeth Tower at Westminster Palace, commonly called Big Ben. After more than 3 centuries of use, the borough halls were showing their age, and so a restoration and an extension was undertaken by Malcolm Fraser Architects in 2011 at a cost of £5.2 million. There are still 2 fine public halls, the south or Bailey Hardy Hall, and the north or Provost Laurie Hall, which now has French windows accessing a roof terrace. The renovation was much appreciated, although it was lamented that some features were obliterated, lost, including the entrance to the old fire station with the associated wording over the lintel. Also lost from the area in front of the toll booth is the Tron, the borough weighing machine on which goods were assessed for taxation. Also gone is the old Market Cross, the object which actually gave its name to the square. However, the large, elaborately carved well in the centre has on its top a unicorn, copied from that on the original Market Cross structure. Also missing from the cross is the statue of John Adrian Louis Hope, Marquis of Linlithgow. He's not lost completely, he's just been shifted away from his pride of place in the centre of the borough, after which he took his title. The statue was unveiled on October the 5th, 1911, an occasion captured here by photographer Robert Braid. Here you see Provost Robert Jamieson speaking amidst the good and the great of the early 20th century, including Lord Rosebery, Colonel Cadell of Grange, Charles Chalmers of Longcroft, Fred Johnson, newspaper proprietor, Town Clerk J.G.B. Henderson, and the Reverend John Ferguson of St. Michael's. Also present was the sculptor, George Frampton, the creator of the lions outside the British Museum, the statue of Edith Cavell beside the National Portrait Gallery, and the one shown here, Peter Pan, in Kensington Gardens. The master of ceremonies at the unveiling was popular landowner and one-time master of the Linlithgow and Stirlingshire Hunt, Adam Cross of Craigie Hall House, until 2015, the British Army HQ near Kirkliston. He apologised to the dignitaries lined up in front of the Borough Hall that they were staring at the good Earl's backside, but assured them that from the front, the statue was an excellent likeness. It was then unveiled, following which John Ferguson led the gathering in prayer, referring to the Marquis as a man greatly loved, and I express the hope that the statue will be a lasting memorial placed forever in this spot as a permanent reminder of the affection in which he was held. Provost Jamieson echoed this sentiment, declaring he had great pleasure in taking over the custody of this beautiful memorial, quote, placed forever where it ought to be, in the midst of people where he was much beloved. Well, the good Earl remained on his 9-foot-high, 25-ton plinth of Scottish granite for only 59 years, his hue gradually taking on the green sheen that happens when bronze oxidizes. By 1970, he was in the way of parking and moved to the area behind the Borough Halls where he stands today, forlorn, tears running down his cheeks and his sword of state broken, a lost man. Hundreds had contributed towards the project to honour a man who had been the first Governor-General of Australia, appointed by Queen Victoria in 1900. The Australians welcomed and took to the sociable young man who loved to party. His favourite pub in Sydney, the Cockatoo Inn, was renamed the Hopetoun Hotel in his honour. He did fall foul of Australian politics at times, and as an outspoken character, he could put his foot in it. There was also some criticism at the way he carried out his role in a very regal and expensive fashion. Nevertheless, he performed a difficult job and was fully deserving of recognition back in Scotland, where he was awarded the freedom of Linlithgow. His health was drunk that night in every public house in town, of which Linlithgow had many. As the county town and the site of a weekly market, farmers, tradesmen, dealers of all sorts would congregate in the borough. And at the end of trading, they were inevitably and frequently thirsty. Sadly, lost to the town are many of their watering holes, such as those shown here. Some you may remember, others you won't. In living memory, others have shut up shop or been taken over, including the Rosy Posy, alias the Kelpies, alias the Linlithgow Wine Bar, and now the Salt and Pepper Street Food Outlet, whatever that is. The old hole in the wall has been renamed. The Cross Keys has gone. The Swan is closed. The Red Lion with its bowling alley is an Italian restaurant. The Unicorn has vanished. And the Star and Garter I saw being painted and cleaned up this week. So hopefully somebody's interested in that. The Black Bitch pub is still there, but under a new name given by the owner's Green King, out of perceived political correctness. As you can see on the right, the old name is still there, just waiting to be uncovered by future, better informed owners. It's not only pubs we've lost. Linlithgow has also lost its breweries. There were 3 at one time. This is Aiken's in the bottom left. And all the town's distilleries. There were 4 of them once, but by the mid-19th century, only 1 left, St Magdalene's. It began life at Bonnyton Farm before moving to the Edinburgh Road, where a natural spring supplied the water. The company, owned by Provost Adam Dawson, moved in 1834 to that site to be nearer the canal as a means of bringing in grain and shipping out barrels of the matured liquid at the rate of 4,000 gallons a week. Production at St Magdalene ceased in 1983, later than many of the town's trades, it has to be said. Shoemaking once employed hundreds of local workers, the leather coming from the town's many tanneries, like Hardy's, the one shown here, bottom left. Also departed trades include papermaking and glue production on the site of the present St Joseph's Primary School, the subject of my next Black Bitch article. The Nobel Explosive Factory, which opened in 1901, has been well covered in previous presentations. In the late 1940s, it was brought over by Imperial Chemical Industry, and until 1965, the workforce produced various pharmaceutical products, including Savalon cream. It was demolished in 1982, and the site used for a William Lowe's supermarket. Many other buildings have been lost from Linlithgow High Street. Here, left to right, is 176 High Street, which housed the real Italian ice cream saloon operated by the Lamara family. The 1900 photograph also shows covered arcades, once used as booths selling various products. In the centre is Hawthornden's land, the townhouse of the Drummond family, whose most prominent member was the poet, William Drummond. For many years, the building was lime-washed in a bright yellow, giving it the local nickname of Canary Island. To the right is Bean Castle, a row of 18th century buildings, now, like all of these properties, lost. And how about these? The townhouse of the Cornwalls of Bonnard, the crest bearing the date 1527, and the family motto, "We build, you see, warily." Next, Westport Cottages, some of the first historical properties to be demolished, in this case in the 1930s, to provide for flats. Even earlier to disappear were the buildings from which the Regent Murray was shot, and Broccoli's land, cleared to make way for the Victoria Hall, and the Greenyards, which became the site of Linlithgow's first purpose-built post office, which opened in 1904. Scenes here of even more destruction. The tenements where Beeld housing is now, initially demolished in the 1930s to build a cinema, which never materialized. And on the right, the Westport Well, hit by a motorist and never rebuilt. Perhaps the most significant building to go was the early 16th century Linlithgow headquarters of the Knights of St John, the Mint, a solid 4-story building which boasted a magnificent dining hall with an elaborate oak-beamed roof. It went in 1885 in order to build St Michael's Hotel, which you see here on the left. Like many hostelries, it had attached stables and hired out horses and carriages. The receipt on the right was for carrying Provost Jamieson to Blackness on March's Day, 1904. Time for just a few more lost properties, like the United Presbyterian Church at the top of Dogwell Wynd. the teen barn belonging to the Carmelite Friary and used to keep grain paid in lieu of tax by the townsfolk in the area. And bottom right, the town has lost the White House, which was offered to the National Trust in 1970. And sadly, the organisation dithered. And by the time they agreed to take it over and restore it as a fascinating 18th century cottage, the house had been sold and demolished by Jim Shanks. So bit by bit, the historic landscape of Linlithgow was changing. In the centre of this 1950s view, the west side of the cross and the John Hope statue can be seen. Dominating the streetscape, however, is the massive Victorian mock Gothic construction of the Victoria Hall, always, in my opinion, too dominant, out of scale with the other properties around it. It was opened in 1888 as a tribute to the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. With its elaborate turreted roofline and huge stained glass window, it served the community for almost 70 years as a concert and dance venue. In 1956, it was sold to a cinema company, and for some years, it existed under the name of the Empire, or then the Ritz. For economic reasons, the cinema owners removed the Gothic pinnacles and blocked up the front picture window. And in that reduced state, it struggled on into the 1990s, when after a short time as an amusement arcade, it was reduced to nothing but a frontage, with only a few reminders of its last incarnation. It was finally all removed in 2018, leaving an unsightly gap site still to be filled. Linlithgow is no stranger to high street demolition. The biggest development began in the 1960s, and first to go were the old properties at the Vennel and along the north side of the West High Street. 18th and 19th century buildings were torn down and a new concrete jungle emerged. Several shops like Younger, the bakers, which had existed in Linlithgow for several generations, briefly clung on, but were then pulled down and replaced by flatted living accommodation. From the Vennel to the Westport, stopping at the Customs House Hotel, the tall building you can see on the extreme right, Linlithgow's landscape was changing. The view on the left, with its unmetalled high street, was taken in 1905, with not a car in sight. The only transport visible outside the Westport Hotel are bicycles. In this 1903 view of the West High Street, a hand-pulled cart is the only conveyance in evidence. You're coming up here on the left to Annet House, the Golden Chip, and then St. Peter's Church just out of sight round the corner. With various Edwardian fashions present here, it's a scene lost forever to history. Depicted here, this is my most recent postcard purchase. This is the view from the cross, looking south, taken in 1908. The 17th and 18th century shops and houses were knocked down in the 1930s to provide the town with a bus depot, which existed until 2014, when it too made way, this time for the McCarthy and Stone retirement development. It was the year 1966 when it was decided to pull down the west side of the cross. Original plans and, as you see top left, aerial photographs show it being retained and restored. But that obviously fell through, despite protests from a small band led by the Scottish actor Moultrie Kelsall. But the protesters were too late. From the 1950s onwards, the Linlithgow Town Council had been thinking of ways to widen the roadway. Whenever a high street property became vacant, especially at the narrowest part, west of the cross, they would buy that property and leave it empty. In 1953, the town's MP, John Taylor, made a speech in the House of Commons, which I found in Hansard. Quote, "Linlithgow High Street is a famous thoroughfare, crammed with history, but tonight I am concerned with its present and future. It is part of the great trunk road from London to John O'Groats, but suddenly, after Linlithgow Cross, the roadway narrows to a lane only 19 feet wide. There is barely room for two normal-sized lorries to pass each other. The frequent congestion in this busy main thoroughfare can only be imagined." And he went on, the demolition of 45 houses and 12 shops is not a major problem. The tenement house at number 142 is a very old, decrepit property, for example, in which 3 families live in a state of almost indescribable squalor. It will be a blessing when that property is demolished and the inhabitants removed to sound and healthy houses. Provost Morrison was in agreement. Before each Marches Day, during his term of office, he made a plea to use bunting and flags to, quote, disguise unoccupied, unsightly buildings on the Cross Brae, all unfit for modern living. Eventually, the local authority got their way, and in the 1960s, the whole north side of Cross Brae was lost. Many old buildings, such as the Spanish ambassador's house and several long-established shops, were permanently lost. I wonder if you remember any of these Linlithgow shops that have gone: Lermonth the butchers, Gillespie the ironmongers, Veitch the drapers, top right, and the Central Dairy, bottom right. Perhaps not. I think Lermonth the butcher looks to be a Victorian establishment. But it's always sad, isn't it, when a long-loved part of town disappears, the most recent being the closure of Oliphant's, the bakers, established in 1856, and now, after 168 years, gone. It looks like a bakery chain will take over the shop, but it won't have Oliphant's pies. And most of the banks have gone, swept aside in the age of online banking and internet accounts. The Royal Bank, the Clydesdale, and in all likelihood, they'll be joined by the Bank of Scotland. We wait to hear. Change has to happen, I know that, and very few would argue with the removal of the town's poorhouse, top left, the county jail, top right, the gasworks, and a garage and filling station right in the middle of the high street. But I always wonder why so much of the old town had to be lost to posterity. I agree with architectural historian Stuart Eidman, who wrote that the 1960s development was, quote, one of the worst losses of historic townscape in Scotland, involving a brutalist approach which destroyed the impact of the high street and shattered the historical drama of its past. I suppose we should revel in what's left of the old historic town and not simply lament that which is gone, but it's hard not to dwell on the Linlithgow we have lost. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can be unmuted. Just going to tell you all, don't miss the next thrilling episode, which is a ghost walk on Halloween. So pull your curtains, switch off the lights, pour yourself a glass of fortifying liquid, and be prepared to be terrified at another walk on the dark side of Linlithgow.
Thank you.